Captain Peter McQuay stood on the quarterdeck of HMS Daedalus, 500 miles off the western coast of Africa, watching a midshipman point at something in the water. It was late afternoon on the 6th of August, 1848. The sea was calm. The ship was making steady progress toward St. Helena on her voyage home from the East Indies. And then the young officer said something that made the captain lift his glass to his eye and go completely still. Whatever he was looking at was moving against the swell, holding a steady course, and it was longer than a ship's mast laid flat across the surface. For the next 20 minutes, several officers and men of the Royal Navy watched it in daylight, and when the Daedalus finally reached England, the story would land on the desk of the Admiralty itself, be printed in the newspapers, and force the most respected scientific minds of the age to explain something that trained naval observers swore they had seen with their own eyes. To understand why this sighting mattered, you have to understand who these men were. The Royal Navy of the 1840s was the most powerful maritime force on Earth. Its officers were not superstitious villagers frightened by shadows. They were professional navigators trained to estimate distance, speed, and size at sea because their lives and their ships depended on those judgments. When a naval officer recorded the length of an object on the water, he was doing the thing he had been trained to do since boyhood. That is what makes the Daedalus report so difficult to dismiss. McQuay was an experienced commander nearing the end of a long voyage. His crew were tired men looking forward to home. There was no expedition searching for monsters, no reward for a sensational discovery, no reason to invent anything. They were simply crossing an empty stretch of the South Atlantic when the ordinary afternoon changed. According to the account McQuay later gave, the object passed close enough that the men could see it clearly without needing to guess. It held its head and neck above the water. It did not dive. It did not thrash. It moved at a steady pace, perhaps 10 knots, and it never once appeared to use the surface motion that a whale or a large fish would use to propel itself. There was no visible undulation to explain how it moved. That single detail is the one that would trouble people for the next century and a half. Because if it did not move like anything known, then what were they watching? The men reported that the creature's head resembled that of a snake, and that a great length of it remained above the waterline as it traveled. They spoke of a dark coloring on the upper body and something lighter beneath. Some described what looked like a mane or a mass of weed trailing along its back. It passed so near the ship that McQuay would later insist he could have recognized a person's features at that distance. For 20 minutes it stayed in view. Then it continued on its course to the southwest and was gone. Now, here is where the story stops being a simple sea tale and becomes something more revealing. When the Daedalus returned to Plymouth in October of 1848, word of the sighting reached the press before it reached the public in any organized way. A newspaper printed a version of the encounter. And this is important because it meant the Admiralty was now aware that one of its ships had a crew claiming to have seen a sea serpent. The Admiralty did something that tells you how seriously they took the professional reputation of their officers. They asked Captain McQuay to provide an official written account. He did, and he did not hedge. He did not soften it into something safe. He described what he and his officers had seen, stated the estimated length as something on the order of 60 feet visible above the water, and stood behind the observation as a naval officer standing behind his own testimony. That report was published, and it turned a shipboard curiosity into a national conversation. The reason it caused such a stir is that it could not be waved away as the imagination of one frightened man in the dark. This was a daylight sighting, over a sustained period, by multiple trained observers, recorded in the measured language of a professional report. And that is exactly why the most famous naturalist in Britain decided he had to respond. Richard Owen was one of the leading anatomists of the 19th century. He was the man who would later coin the word dinosaur. He was brilliant, respected, and deeply confident in his own judgment, and he did not believe there was an unknown 60-foot serpent swimming in the Atlantic. Owen offered an explanation that was, in its way, just as bold as the sighting itself. He suggested that what the men of the Daedalus had seen was not a serpent at all, but a very large seal, or possibly a sea elephant, an animal that could raise its head and forebody out of the water and might, at a distance and to an unprepared eye, present a long dark shape moving through the swell. He implied, with the polite ruthlessness of a Victorian expert, that the officers had misjudged what they saw. It was a reasonable argument on paper. Large pinnipeds do exist. People do misjudge scale at sea, and a scientist has every right to prefer a known animal over an unknown monster. But McQuay was not a man to be told he could not identify a seal. He responded publicly. He pointed out the flaws in Owen's reconstruction. The thing they had watched had not behaved like a seal. It had held a long continuous body above the surface and traveled in a straight line without the rolling, diving motion a seal uses. He and his officers had watched it for a sustained period in clear conditions at close range. He was, in effect, defending not just the sighting but the competence of the Royal Navy's trained eyes against the authority of the greatest anatomist in the country. This was the real drama of the Daedalus case. Not a monster rising from the deep, but a collision between two kinds of authority. On one side, professional observers who insisted on what they had seen. On the other, scientific expertise that insisted on what was possible. Neither side could produce the one thing that would settle it. There was no body, no photograph, no specimen, only testimony and interpretation. And the Daedalus was not the only Royal Navy ship to leave such a record. Throughout the 19th century, as British warships crossed every ocean on Earth, similar reports surfaced from other vessels and other officers. Sailors of the period repeatedly described long, dark shapes, humps moving in procession, and heads raised above the water. Many of these accounts share a strange consistency. Again and again witnesses describe not a fish, not a whale, but something long and serpentine that moved in a way they could not match to any animal they knew. One of the most striking of these later encounters was recorded aboard the Royal Yacht Osborne in the 1870s in the Mediterranean off the coast of Sicily. Officers aboard the vessel reported seeing an enormous creature. According to the accounts that came from that ship, they described a long ridge of the animal's back breaking the surface and large fin-like limbs by which it appeared to move itself through the water. The description of paddle-like limbs was unusual, because it did not match the pure serpent image at all. It sounded, to some later readers, disturbingly like the reconstructed body of a long-extinct marine reptile. That comparison is where the whole subject becomes genuinely fascinating, and where we have to be careful. By the middle of the 19th century, science had begun uncovering the fossilized skeletons of creatures like the plesiosaur, a marine reptile with a long neck, a bulky body, and 4 large paddles. To a Victorian public newly aware that such animals had once existed, the leap was irresistible. If these long-necked sea creatures had lived in the deep past, perhaps a few had survived, unseen, in the vast unexplored oceans. Perhaps the thing the Daedalus saw was a living remnant of that lost world. It is a thrilling idea. It is also almost certainly wrong, and it is worth being honest about why. There is no fossil evidence that these marine reptiles survived into recent times. The gap between their disappearance and the age of sailing ships is measured in tens of millions of years, and a large air-breathing animal living near the surface of well-traveled shipping lanes would, over centuries, leave more than a handful of disputed sightings. It would leave carcasses, bones, something a museum could hold. So what did these men actually see? This is where we have to separate what is documented from what is imagined. The reports themselves are real. The Daedalus account exists. McQuay's testimony exists. The public exchange with Owen exists. These are matters of record. What remains uncertain is the interpretation, and here the honest answer is that several ordinary explanations can account for most of what was reported, though not always comfortably. The strongest general explanation is misidentification of known animals seen under unusual conditions. A line of porpoises or dolphins surfacing in sequence can create the illusion of a single long body with multiple humps moving through the water. A large basking shark, especially a decomposing one, can present a bizarre and unfamiliar shape. Floating masses of seaweed or long ribbons of kelp can be mistaken for a living creature. Even a giant squid, an animal that genuinely exists and was itself once considered a myth, could account for some strange sightings of tentacled shapes at the surface. Owen's own explanation, the large seal or sea lion, deserves credit for one thing. It correctly identified that people at sea often misjudge scale, distance, and motion, and that the human mind fills gaps with pattern. A dark shape at an uncertain distance becomes far larger and far stranger in memory than it was in reality. But each of these explanations accounts for some cases while struggling with others. The Daedalus sighting resists the seal theory precisely on the point McQuay raised. Trained observers watched for a sustained period, in daylight, at close range, and reported motion that did not match a diving, rolling seal. If they were right about the movement, the seal fails. If they were wrong about the movement, then we are admitting that even careful naval officers can be badly mistaken for 20 continuous minutes, which is its own unsettling conclusion. The procession of porpoises explanation works beautifully for the classic string of humps, but it does not easily produce a single raised head and neck held steadily above the water. And this is the pattern across the whole body of Royal Navy sea monster reports. No single explanation covers all of them, and yet none of them requires a surviving prehistoric reptile. What they require is a combination of ordinary things seen in extraordinary circumstances, filtered through the expectations of the age, and recorded by men whose professional pride would not let them admit they might have been fooled. There is one more factor that historians of these sightings tend to emphasize, and it is the most human of all. The 19th century was hungry for sea serpents. Newspapers loved them. The public devoured them. A captain who reported one became briefly famous. This does not mean the officers lied. There is no evidence that McQuay or any of the others invented their reports. But it does mean that once the idea of the sea serpent existed in the culture, ambiguous shapes at sea were far more likely to be interpreted as monsters, and far more likely to be written down and passed along. The mystery, in the end, is not really about biology. It is about the limits of human observation and the reliability of testimony from people we would normally trust completely. Because that is what lingers about the Daedalus. We are not dealing with a drunken sailor or a frightened passenger. We are dealing with a Royal Navy captain who put his professional reputation in writing, submitted it to the Admiralty, defended it against the most eminent scientist of his day, and never backed down. He gained little and risked his credibility. Every incentive he had pointed towards staying silent, and still he insisted, to the end, that he knew what a seal looked like, and that what passed his ship that August afternoon was not a seal. We will probably never recover the creature that swam past the Daedalus. The ocean keeps its evidence, and the men who watched it are long gone. What survives is their certainty, preserved in the calm official language of a naval report, describing something long and dark moving in a straight line through a quiet sea, holding its head above the water, refusing to behave like anything they had ever been trained to recognize. McQuay could have described a whale. He could have described a seal. He had the vocabulary of a lifetime at sea to draw on. He chose none of those words. He said it was a serpent.